So thank you for having me this afternoon, is what I was trying to say. I hope that you will humor me as I get started to demonstrate a point, which hopefully will be made clear in just a few moments. Now, I don't want anyone to get hurt, but I'm asking everyone to try to hold your breath. Take a deep breath, and I'll count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. How are you all feeling? Did you make it to 15?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for indulging me for those few seconds. When I tried it earlier, I barely made it to 45 seconds and was, of course, at the end, anxiously gasping for air. The air we breathe, the water we drink, are often taken for granted, until we no longer have them, that is. The rule of threes tells us that you can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and 3 weeks without food. So often, we consider ourselves separate from nature when we are intimately interdependent. Many times in educating and partnering with churches in my work, I talk about the concept of creation care. I often remind folks that creation is not just the trees and animals and rivers. We as people are also part of it. So that when faith communities have a call to be stewards of creation, that also includes being stewards of our neighbors as well. Especially those neighbors who are different from who we are. And furthermore, when thinking about the vast diversity, the complex ecology of the earth, I think John Muir, the naturalist advocate and philosopher, said it best, that when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world. Okay, that's it. Thank you for completely humoring me now. I will get off my soapbox. As was said, my name is Kendyl Crawley Crawford. I'm the director of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light, a program of the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. The mission of Virginia Interfaith Power and Light is to collaborate as people of faith to grow healthy communities and advance climate justice through education, advocacy, and worship. Today, I know that we are here to talk about peace, not necessarily the environment, and that's exactly what we'll do. In my time with you, I'm going to talk a little about my personal story, then we will explore together how the environment, specifically the issue of climate change, impacts peace. And lastly, I'll share some lessons that we will all need to be able to rise to the challenge of creating a livable, just, and peaceful world. Does that sound good? Okay, so here we go. If you all said no, I would have been like, oh no, I don't know what to do now for all this. So starting with a little more about myself and how I came to be interested in doing climate justice work. I remember being back in high school, 2005, watching Hurricane Katrina unfold on TV, the devastation, destruction, and death that took place. Almost 2,000 people died. That moment pulled back the curtain and revealed 2 things for me. Number 1, the persistent inequities of our society and how far we must continue to move towards true liberty and justice for all. And number 2, how integrally we all are connected with and rely on the planet. I realized that climate change and environmental justice intersect with other social issues, such as racism, economic justice, poverty, equity, disenfranchisement of communities, and migration, just to name a few. Jumping forward to 2020, just in the past couple of years, we have witnessed an even more devastating hurricane, Maria, that killed over 3,000 people, more than Katrina. Puerto Rico is still reeling to this day. Now, 3 years later, with as of last fall, about 30,000 people still living under temporary blue tarps or with no roofs at all. Last year, we saw Hurricane Dorian hit the Bahamas with wind speeds of more than 180 miles per hour, making it the strongest landfalling hurricane in the Atlantic on record. Global warming will continue to make record-breaking hurricanes more deadly and destructive, just as of the past 5 years have been the hottest 5 on record since we began keeping track, with all of that heat powerfully fueling the deadly engines of hurricanes. But a warming world doesn't just mean more extreme storms. It also means more droughts, more massive wildfires, think a burning Australia, more famines and starvation, more deserts, more disease, more refugees, more poverty, and more conflict. Even the Pentagon has deemed climate change a threat multiplier. In short, more suffering and exacerbation of our existing social and economic inequalities. We are now living in a world where experts have made it painfully clear in report after report that we only have a few years, 10 to be exact, to limit dangerous warming by substantially cutting our carbon pollution by about half. Doing this would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The big deal between allowing 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming is that several 100 million more people would be exposed to dangerous climate-related risks by 2050. The kicker is, though, that we are not headed towards 1.5 degrees of warming or even 2 degrees. We are on a business-as-usual track to have 3 or higher degrees of warming by the end of the century at the rate that we are going. Yet and still, up against these tough odds, I have been so incredibly inspired and filled with hope, seeing the activism of young folks like Greta Thunberg, the 17-year-old Swedish activist who is leading a global youth movement to demand that the issue of climate change be treated with the seriousness that it deserves by our world leaders. In preparing for my remarks today, I reviewed the profiles of the students receiving awards. I was amazed at the work that is being done to create inclusive communities, accepting of immigrants, refugees, and those with different abilities, faiths, and races. I was amazed at the efforts to care for our neighbors here and around the world and empower them while dismantling hate and violence. And of course, I especially appreciated the endeavors to repair our relationship with our mother, the earth. Let's give these young leaders a big round of applause. Thank you very much. So turning back to the relationship between climate and the anti-peace, conflict. A report released last year by the U.S. Army War College was absolutely terrifying. This report reads that, and a quick warning for you all to hold onto your chairs because I was blown away when I read it. Sea level rise, changes in water and food security, and more frequent extreme weather events are likely to result in the migration of large segments of the population. Rising seas will displace tens, if not hundreds, of millions of people, creating massive, enduring instability. Recent history has shown that mass human migrations can result in increased propensity for conflict and turmoil as new populations intermingle with and compete against established populations. A warming trend will also increase the range of insects that are vectors of infectious tropical diseases. This, coupled with large-scale human migration from tropical nations, will increase the spread of infectious disease. The decrease in Arctic sea ice and associated sea level rise will bring conflicting claims to newly accessible natural resources. It will also introduce a new theater of direct military contact, the increased likelihood of more intense and longer duration drought in some areas, accompanied by greater atmospheric heating, will put an increased strain on the aging U.S. power grid. Power generation in U.S. hydroelectric and nuclear facilities will be affected. This dual attack on both supply and demand could create more frequent, widespread, and enduring power grid failures, handicapping the U.S. economy. That's straight from the U.S. Army. And to recap those pressures, that was forcing potentially hundreds of millions of starving and parched people to flee from their homes, increasing instability. Number 2, conflict between newly arriving and existing populations of people. Number 3, disease. Number 4, conflict over newly available resources, creating new theaters of direct military conflict. And number 5, power grid failures, potentially handicapping the economy. Do any of these things seem like they may impact our efforts to achieve peace to you? Nah, I don't see it either. Just kidding. And then, of course, we must also think about what this conflict and climate confluence looks like on a more human note. What would you do if your family could not find food to eat or had to face rolling blackouts? You'd probably move if you had the resources. Folks around the world are being presented with hard questions right now. To farmers in rural Niger and Sierra Leone, they have had to ask themselves, now, because my farm depended on rain that never fell and I couldn't grow my crops, should I now join the rebel army movement as a way to provide for myself? To mothers in poverty in Dolkali, India, they have had to ask themselves, now, because of the massive destruction and damage caused by Cyclone Ayla, does this make my family less safe by increasing our vulnerability to child trafficking? To coffee farmers in Honduras, they have had to ask themselves, should I flee poverty and gang violence to try to cross the border and make it into the United States, where I'll have a better chance of providing for my family now that changes in climate have devastated my crops? These are just some of the questions people around the world have asked and will continue to ask themselves as they try to care for their families and navigate through a maze of climate disruption, violence, conflict, migration, and politics. Now that we have established what type of dilemma we as peacemakers are up against in terms of climate change, I want to leave you, especially the students and young people here today, with 3 pieces of advice. The first one, use what you have. In the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. We as a society, and especially we as peacemakers, must keep moving forward. We have to accept the dismaying fact that none of us are perfect, never were perfect, never will be perfect. We are all human, and we all make mistakes. Each one of us, though, has been given unique gifts to work in community to make the world a better place, and we have a responsibility to use them to try. Are you creative? Are you a good communicator? Do you naturally bring people together? Do you see beauty in the mundane? Are you a math and science whiz? Whatever your gift, don't worry about perfection. Just make sure that you are using what you have to do the best you can. When we use what we have, that means that we are not writing off ourselves or writing off hard problems to solve. It's up to us to take responsibility and to chip away at problems, no matter how small and insignificant our chips may feel. We must endeavor to build a massive movement of folks thinking globally and acting locally. The magic is in the doing together, all headed towards a common goal. My second piece of advice is, when in doubt, lead. I used to think that leadership was just telling people what to do. But as I've learned, and as Oprah has put it, leadership is about empathy. It is about having the ability to relate to and connect with people for the purpose of inspiring and empowering their lives. You may feel ill-prepared You may feel that you don't know enough, but I implore you to speak up, take on a leadership role, run for office, seize opportunities, and continue being advocates and change makers for peace. And as you take on new leadership roles, make sure that you are self-aware and are always seeking input and learning. Being a leader takes lots of hard work, just like everything else that's worthwhile in life. But I'm happy to remind you that our communities and this blue marble careening through space are both worth the effort. My last tip for you today is to pursue justice. As was said by author, social critic, and philosopher Dr. Cornel West, never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. So in the face of a dangerous changing climate and environmental degradation, we must ask ourselves, are we willing to let our neighbors live in sacrifice zones? Are we willing to expose future generations to dangers and risks not experienced before? So I don't see climate change as just a scientific or a political issue or just an environmental issue. I see it as a moral one. At its core, it's an issue, a stimulus that must have a justice response. We've discussed a number of ways that conflict and climate are connected this afternoon. But one that I have yet to mention to you, actually the one that scares me the most, is the question, will we allow climate change to change us into people who are okay with a more conflict-ridden and violent world? Are we becoming more apathetic to suffering? Are we tuning out with each new news story covering the latest super hurricane, broken record, or latest wildfire? Have we already done this? Worldwide, we are seeing a rise in opportunists dubbed conflict entrepreneurs. These are folks seeking power, often xenophobic politicians who prey on our lower tendencies towards fear and blame and violence and separate us from one another. We must stay steadfast in our pursuit of justice especially in these cases, and challenge these conflict entrepreneurs to de-escalate conflict, replacing it with the seeds of a just and sustainable peace, a forebearer of communal liberation. In the struggle to reduce fossil fuels, it certainly would be a shame to have simply recreated the same oppressions, conflict, and violence of the past in our carbon-free economy of the future. Continually leaving whole communities behind, we can't stay silent. This is the time to speak up, to elevate the issue to decision makers, and to hold them accountable at the polls every November and during primaries like the one coming up on this Tuesday. Before I conclude, a quick recap of my tips. Number 1, use what you have. Number 2, when in doubt, lead. Number 3, pursue justice. As my time with you comes to a close, I want us all to think back to how we started out together, how we collectively held our breath. In those brief seconds, we were momentarily cut off from the ever-flowing exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide that we share with plants and phytoplankton. Think about how vital this connection is to sustain us, how being separated from it for just 3 minutes, 180 seconds, is the difference between us living and dying. And of course, it's not just air which connects us. We share and depend on each other for a lot more than that. We depend on the earth, we depend on our communities, and in this globalized world, we depend on strangers living in places that we've never even thought to think about. As peacemakers, we know that peacemaking takes work. A fragile peace can break just as a long-time conflict can end. And the same holds true for the problem of climate change. We can make it better or we can make it worse. It's just a matter of deciding what we want. I hope that we will allow in some emotion to cloud our decision-making here. I hope we will allow in love. As the guitarist, singer, songwriter Jimi Hendrix once put it, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. Let me repeat that. When the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. I implore you today to recommit to help build the power of love and the way of peace. Thank you so much for listening and for this time to share some thoughts with you all.